This is Dylan Moore with Irida TV coming to you today. It is March 1st, 2023. It is a Wednesday today, and I've got none other than Herr from the Center for Self-Governance on because there's an important topic that Herr's talking about it all the time, but I don't see talked about everywhere else. And I wanted to have a conversation so that this could get proliferated more, which is specifically the political weaponization. Political weaponization of labels or political weaponization of language. But there's been a very, very interesting development in this sphere where we're going to delve into this, but it could be construed, I think, accurately that private entities at some level are gaining access to legislative powers over the definitions of certain words, and they're able to use those definitions to weaponize a situation or to weaponize government against people that these private entities don't necessarily like. And this is a step beyond the normal process, because the normal process is get that power over to a bureaucracy. But we're seeing, which that's one layer removed from the standard electoral process that we have. But we're even seeing there's a step beyond that, which is not even in the bureaucracy, but get that over to the these private entities that create their own labels without any reference to any sort of government procedure whatsoever, and that creates a very interesting situation, which is what I wanted to talk about. But before that, Mark, thank you for taking the time to come on. I know you're super busy.
Well, so are you, Dylan. But thank you for having us on to proliferate this conversation.
Right. So I want to hand it over to you for the starting point in this. I've said this very vaguely. Let's start getting more specific. Which label, which private organizations are we talking about, and what are the ramifications of this situation?
So if we just look back in world history, we can see when you have a political opponent and you control the government, your natural instinct is to weaponize labels to make your opponents look bad, right? We did this in high school, right? We'd call them jerks or nerds or jocks or whatever. We would call each other names. And it would be to help to kind of identify who fits where in what box.
And because he's a jerk or because he's a nerd or because he's a jock, we could do X, Y, and Z to that person.
That's right, because they'll have a certain quality of being a villain, right? It's kind of like the Marvel, Iron Man versus the bad guy, right? Mm-hmm. Batman versus the Joker. And so we create this in our human relationships. We naturally create the hero, victim, villain box. And so we'll use labels to describe the villain. It's been done for thousands of years. And for those who control the government, if they control the label, then they naturally, instinctively will turn the government into a weapon against those that they've labeled. So for example, Jesus, way back 2,000 years ago, whatever, according to the Bible, he's labeled an insurrectionist. And so the people who are supposedly the leaders of God's people, right, Pharisees and Sadducees, they weaponize the label. And in doing so, then they start using their influence to weaponize the Roman government. And they weaponize their influence to incite the mobs and to call for the release of an actual criminal, Barabbas, and the execution of Jesus. And eventually Pilate, etc. Barabbas is released and Jesus is executed. If you jump forward, the Roman Empire is collapsing, and Constantine in 325 AD creates the Nicene Creed or Nicene Council, and then they put out the Nicene Creed. This results in the Catholic Church. And ultimately it was for preserving the Roman Empire, because the labels for the Christians weren't working. They weren't able to stamp out Christianity. So the smartest thing they could think of was, well, then let's have the Roman Empire absorb Christianity, control Christianity, Nicene Council, Nicene Creed, hence you have the Roman Catholic Church. Anyway, this kind of spreads into England, and the Catholics they get themselves into the monarchy, and the Protestants show up. And so the Catholics then begin to weaponize the labels. And then through the weaponization, because they controlled the government, weaponized the government, they started imprisoning, taking the property, killing, executing Protestants. Now, so the Protestants organized, took over the monarchy, and then would repeat the same thing with the Catholics. Fast forward to the 1600s. Puritans fled the religious persecution of the state Church of England, where that whole thing was going back and forth, Catholics and Protestants, okay? The Puritans had a different doctrine, and so they were being persecuted by King James, the guy who wrote the King James Version of the Bible. And so they fled his persecution and entered into Massachusetts. They created the Massachusetts government. Eventually, the Quakers showed up. So you have this Puritan Quaker. Then the Puritans, because they controlled the government, they were able to weaponize the labels and weaponize the government. They started taking the Quakers' property, beating them in public. And by 1658, they actually passed a law to execute Quakers. So if you fast forward to our time frame, so last century, 20th century, the Germans weaponized labels parasite and rats to describe Jews. And then when they gained control of the German government, they weaponized the government to execute the Jews, to murder them, genocide. You come to the United States, it's World War II, and we're afraid of the Japanese because they attacked, Pearl Harbor. Now we're in World War II. And so our country, our nation, we weaponized the labels related to Japanese, treason, enemy, that kind of thing. And then we started imprisoning them. Fast forward to our time frame, 2023. Here in the United States, we have a situation now where the labels, extreme, hate, white supremacist, anti-government, those four labels are being propagated through non-government organizations and the media repeatedly on a daily basis. Okay. And so if you take these actions, then you must be extreme, hate, white supremacist, anti-government. Okay. So looking back on history and looking at the current situation, it's very similar, just different timeframes. So one type of weaponization of labels in government is Christianity based, right? Jesus, Pharisees, Sadducees, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, Puritans, Quakers. Then it's Germans and Jews, and then you have Americans and Japanese, and now you have non-government organizations in the United States weaponizing labels, four of them: extreme, hate, anti-government, white supremacy. Now, our nation, we allow for the First Amendment. So it's okay. Like, I can call you extreme, hate, white, anti-government. That's my First Amendment, right? Mm-hmm. But here's the problem, Dylan. This right here is the crux of the problem. Is in our system of government, we have checks and balances. So you elect your representatives and they go define the legal meaning of extreme hate, white supremacy, anti-government. Then that definition is transferred to the executive branch, like the president, the governor of Washington, let's say, your sheriff, police chief, school resource officer. Those legal definitions guide their law enforcement behavior. Here's the problem. What happens when private organizations create their private list, private labels, and then privately train those law enforcement officers from the federal to the state to the local without legislative oversight or legal definitions or a legal list? What happens at that point?
All sorts of bad stuff. And before I even attempt to answer that, I think there's a categorical difference of the explanation that you gave that's worth pointing out, because you started off saying, okay, there's this natural tendency for human beings to use these labels, and you said high school is an example. right? Which I think we could all relate to. And then you gave all these examples throughout history. I think it's worth pointing out the categorical difference here between the natural tendency versus the legal process, right? Because
exactly,
we've got the legal process. So let's take all controversy out of here, and we say, okay, we have murder. Murder's bad. We should have a legal process if somebody commits murder, right?
or they're accused of murder.
Or they're accused of murder. Well, okay, there's
Right?
this concept of murder, but then we got to go, okay, what is murder? Is it just killing? No, it's not killing, because there's self-defense, right? There's accidents. There's manslaughter. There's first degree murder. There's all these different definitions, and you can see, like, okay, well, we've talked about this in other shows. We're going to change the definition of murder to include bugs. If you run over a bug with your car, that's murder, right? And then, therefore, if that's part of the definition, that definition gets a hold of you, and you get to go through the legal process of, okay, what does it mean to be accused of murder or convicted of murder or whatever, right? So if
or imprisoned for murder, or then having your life taken because you committed murder. Yes,
right.
That what you're describing, that term is called due process. The
right.
process that's due to you because the legal system has defined that process.
Right. So there's the process, and then there's the definition of the label itself, right? And it seems to me, based on these conversations that we've been having, specifically this one, is that if we had some evil motives in mind, and we're like, okay, we want to control the government, it might be easier to control the definition than it is to control the process.
Or yes, and to get the right number of people elected who agree with my definition of what extreme hate, white supremacy, anti-government are. And then you add a fifth component. I just bypass the legislature, go straight to the executive branch, and provide them with all the training and intelligence based on my definition. And now you are circumventing the legislative process, the legislative definition, the legislative due process altogether. It's actually quite brilliant, and it's happening in the United States right now.
It is evilly brilliant. And then so to answer the question of what does that mean, I think, to put it very succinctly, is it speeds government up to a rate that is very, very dangerous. Because I think one of the most important things about government is to make sure that it slows down. Because when we're talking about government, I mean, we're literally talking about, where is the force and violence going to be directed? That's the conversation, right? How are we going to direct this force and violence? And if one person or one small group of people get a hold of that, and they say, okay, we could just define it however we want, and there's nothing slowing us down from that control, well, they could just go absolutely crazy and do whatever they want so fast that nobody can catch up to it. And part of our system, where we have all these checks and balances. I mean, we're used to the traditional. Okay, you've got the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. But as we've talked about with you before, there's way more than that. There's checks and balances built all into the system to make sure that one group of people can't grab that control and then just start going crazy, making up whatever rules that they want. What you're describing, is if we've got private organizations, and we haven't mentioned what those organizations are yet, but if we have private organizations that can go straight to the executive literally meaning action, right? This is the part of the government that's supposed to take action based on what the legislature says that they're supposed to do. If they could go straight to the executive with the definitions that they now control.
With their definitions.
Yes.
They came up with privately, and then they're now providing training and key intelligence based on their definitions, along with their private lists. It's no longer your congressman who's representing you. It's no longer your state representative or your county commissioners or your city council or your school board members. It's now a private entity creating the definitions, going directly to enforcement, training them to think this way. This is the legal definition. This is the legal application. It's a circumvention of our system of government, and the reason why history matters is because our system calculated those grievances and built it into our system to prevent that from happening during our lifetimes. And this goes to the main point. It's the reason why our system of government has such value in the 21st century. Those checks and balances, if not protected, preserved, or given their proper place in our culture, whether you're libertarian or I'm a conservative or someone's a liberal or whatever you are, that protection for all three of those labels is what prevents someone from creating a private institution, bypassing the system and going to the enforcement mechanism without any check or balance. And that's the beauty of our system and why it's so worth understanding this story. But in the long term, determining for yourself to preserve that system for checks and balances, not just for myself personally, but for you, Dylan, in your belief system. And then together we can determine, you know what, this system is worth protecting regardless of our ideological differences. And that's the 21st century challenge.
Absolutely. Let's get specific now. What private organizations are we talking about, and who are they influencing?
So last year, our organization received a notification from Amazon Smile, which is it's a nonprofit charity program through Amazon.com. And the notification was that we had been flagged for being terroristic or anti-government. And so they just, without any sort of due process, like a court or a hearing or hey, is any of this true? They just like cut it off, terminated it. And so we're like, whoa. So we wrote to Amazon Smile. We said, what happened? We're in good standing. We're taxed. We pay our taxes. We're
above board. Yeah.
we're above board, all this stuff. You can see what we're doing. You know what I mean? Our website is open. We don't use Signal. We don't hide on Telegram, all this stuff. And they said, well, Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC center.org, has flagged you as anti-government. And our policy states that we rely on them to identify villainous organizations that are heretics and witches. And so we started receiving emails and text messages from our students from across the nation saying, what's going on? We're buying stuff at Amazon. We chose you on our Amazon Smile so that our money could go to you, and we can't do that anymore. So what's going on? So not only now were we canceled, our reputation, we had to spend our time explaining ourselves to our students across the United States. And so we hired an attorney to look at, this has caused us harm. The heretic witch label has caused us harm. And we're like, we're not heretics or witches, right? But this nonprofit organization, Southern Poverty Law Center, has labeled us a heretic and a witch. We've now suffered not only financial harm, but reputational harm. Mm-hmm. And so we talked with our attorney, and we sent them a demand for retraction.
And we listed or Amazon?
To SPLC specifically.
Okay.
And by the way, SPLC has canceled Amazon Smile starting this, I think, next month or April. So, and I think it's because of what's happened to us, because they've had so many of our students.
So SPLC canceled Amazon Smile? How come SPLC gets canceled?
No. Amazon has canceled Amazon Smile.
Oh, and you think it's because okay, sorry, continue.
Well, because we hired an attorney, and we started asking these questions legally. We're following we hired an attorney to follow the legal process. Okay. Mm-hmm. And what ends up happening is Amazon cancels Amazon Smile now. And I think because they can see the writings on the wall is that if we go after them, we've got all these thousands of students across the United States that were like texting and emailing us. What happened? We wanted to donate to you guys through our purchases, and we chose you, and what's going on? And we're having all blah, blah, blah. So we sent a demand for retraction to SPLC. And yesterday we received their response.
Ooh, what was it?
And so let me kind of tee it up for you. So in our demand for retraction, we said we've been very clear that we do not consider ourselves anti-government, because anti-government insinuates that we're an enemy of the United States. Now, I'm not an enemy of you. I'm not an enemy of Amazon Smile. I'm not even an enemy of SPLC. Like, there's no thought here of like, you know what, Dylan, let's go accumulate some chemicals so you can go blow up SPLC. Let's do it. You want to do it? No, that's not Center for Self-Governance. It's like, govern yourself, dude, before trying to govern SPLC. And I would ask them to do the same, quite frankly. Govern themselves first before trying to govern Center for Self-Governance, right? And so the key here is that they responded back to our legal inquiry because, again, I just wanted to make this case to your audience. There is a legal process in the United States. And we can make the case that SPLC has circumvented the legal process by becoming a private legislative body, creating their own definitions, their own lists, and their own training and intelligence to law enforcement apart from your representatives, outside of your elected officials in Congress, state legislatures, county commissions, city governments, and school boards. Now, in their response to us, they said, well, these are the reasons why we labeled you anti-government. And they listed two specific things, and then within each of those, a list of things. First, so they said that we teach marble cake federalism and layer cake federalism, and that we call it the marble cake revolution, which we put out a public statement in 2020 about a term that we refer to as the marble cake revolution. And your audience is going like,
what's that?
What is that? Okay. Public schools since the 1960s have been teaching high schoolers that marble cake federalism is the form of government where the federal and the state governments are all mixed together. And that layer cake federalism is where the federal and the state government are separate and distinct. So our organization teaches both marble cake and layer cake federalism as part of our efforts to advance systematic politics, the idea that we should be conversing about our system of government. So if just on that alone should be like, that doesn't make somebody anti-government. It makes it sound like they're talking about the government.
Yeah, we're having a discussion of different types of government. Yeah.
Yes. And we've made it very clear that our organization says that it's monopolistic regarding marble cake federalism, and that layer cake federalism is not given a fair chance in the 21st century. We even argue in our public statements that we're pursuing a hybrid of layer cake and marble cake federalism in the 21st century. We've made that case, and it's public. So their case that because we're teaching layer cake and marble cake federalism, and that we're saying marble cake federalism has a monopoly in the 21st century, that makes us anti-government. And I'm like, no, that makes us exercising our human tendency to question things. Right? There's a Second Amendment, right?
Yeah, we're having a discussion.
Right. And I have my ideas, and you have your ideas, and we're having a back and forth about, well, which one's better, layer cake or marble cake?
Mm-hmm.
My opinion is marble cake has a monopoly right now, and I think we should work together to find a hybrid. Nowhere in there is there a discussion about killing you, blowing you up, doing something illegal, labeling you a heretic or a witch, but literally just saying marble cake federalism has a monopoly. Layer cake federalism is purposely being
left out of the discussion.
Left out of the discussion, or ridiculed or marginalized. And I can make the case that I should have the freedom to make the case that layer cake has value in the 21st century. and not be labeled a heretic and a witch for that by a private organization who is circumventing the legislatures by training based on their definitions law enforcement entities from the federal all the way down to the school. And so in the meantime, so now we end up looking like a Quaker,
In the
right?
Puritan
Who could
system,
be brown.
yes.
Yeah. Yep.
So was there anything else in this letter that's worth repeating that you received back from the SPLC?
Yeah. Well, basically the threat that they have, they will vigorously defend their right to fight extremism. And you know what? And I think this is a really important point. I would fight for their right to fight against extremism.
Mm-hmm. But you won't fight for the right to control the definition of extremism.
I will not fight for them seizing unauthorized legislative authority.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I would stand against, because that is a layer cake function that they are circumventing. And I can make that case in the public sphere, which we're doing now, because I absolutely support their right. They want to call me anti-government, dude, jerk, anti-government, white supremacist, go for it, back and forth. But when they become a private legislative body, circumventing the checks and balances in the layer cake system by training law enforcement outside the oversight of Congress, state legislatures, county commissioners, city councils, and school boards across the United States, duly elected by people like me, because they have a vision and a definition that they believe should be legal, and our system is inefficient to reach their objectives. To me, that's anti-government. Personally, to me, sounds like,
I completely agree. I mean, that's just putting all the power into a private entity.
Yeah, and the executive branch going, we agree with you because you're credible, right? And you're providing us with information and research. And I'm like, according to their non-legal definition.
Well, and then you gave the example of Amazon Smile, right? Let's expand that further. So we had a conversation before about the specifically the term domestic terrorist, right? And how the label, the war of words is happening over that label in particular. And right now we're seeing this attempt at the state level all across the country for the states to incorporate some level of domestic terrorism language that has a very weird weird definition of the label. And in Washington State specifically, I was reading this passed the House, right? The House of Representatives, where there was this proposition, if I remember correctly, that to create to have the Attorney General create a committee to look into domestic terrorism within the state of Washington to create a report, and that committee needs to consist of people from certain marginalized groups. We need a person of color on there. We need someone from the Native Indian tribes. We need someone from India. We need someone, whatever. And two organizations that were on that list were the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center. We need a representative from the Anti-Defamation League and a representative from the Southern Poverty Law Center. Now, fortunately, those two got ripped off the list before it passed the House. So there is that. But the point that I want to make is what we're talking about, these private organizations controlling the definitions of labels. Now it's coming on the actual legal front of how do we inject these people into the committee that's going to be controlling this level over the executive branch, i.e. the Attorney General, right? So this is it's not just Amazon is what I'm getting at here. This is really permeating everywhere. And I wanted to give an example because you keep mentioning the executive branch. Well, let's talk about the executive branch in Washington State, the Attorney General. As far as I understand, this is happening all across the country. I don't know the specifics in each state, but there's this domestic terrorism legislation that's being percolated into all the state legislatures right now.
Yes. So the report is the 2022 Washington Attorney General's Domestic Terrorism Study. And the issue here is that when you, at the federal level, you have Besides the 4 private labels, you have 2 overlapping ambiguous labels at the federal level. The first label is domestic violent extremist, and the second label is domestic terrorist. Now, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security use those 2 labels interchangeably according to their 2020 terminology and methodology statement, where they joined forces to combat what they refer to as domestic violent extremism. Now, this is important because there's not a federal definition for domestic violent extremism. There is a bureaucrat label called the Extremism Lexicon from March of 2009. Now, it was supposedly replaced in the Trump administration in 2017, but my research indicates that they are still using the terminology and lexicon from the 2009 lexicon. And how do I know those kind of things? Because Wikipedia.com has not upgraded to the Trump administration's version of extremism. They have maintained the Obama administration's version of extremism. And this is important because of partisan politics. So you have a private organization, labels with extreme hate, white supremacy, anti-government. Now you have 2 labels in the federal system, domestic violent extremist and domestic terrorism. Now these 4 labels and these 2 interconnect right there. In their world, they call this the wall of frustration. The wall of frustration is right here, okay? At the wall of frustration, there's a new doctrine inside the DHS and the FBI that I'm going to call the honeypot gaslight doctrine. And what it means is, it is better for our law enforcement entities to radicalize you first before you commit an act of violence. Second. Okay, now, right in the middle between the 4 labels and the domestic violent extremist, DVE, and domestic terrorist, DT, right in the middle there is what these people that are supporting these 6 labels believe. They call it the wall of frustration. And before the wall of frustration, there's a pipeline. The first pipeline is the radicalization process. The second part 2, is called strengthening destabilizers. And part 1 is called weakened inhibitors. And primarily, they say that people that enter into this pipeline are nearly exclusively right-wing people. People on the right wing, whatever the right wing means, okay? So in the federal definitions, the legal definitions, there is a legal definition for domestic terrorism. There is not a legal definition for domestic violent extremism, anti-government, white supremacy, extremism, although there are hate crimes, okay? So we can say with 100% accuracy that this is a partisan pipeline to eliminate political opponents who question their specific ideologies.
And then sorry, before you continue, I just want to make sure I got that right, because you mentioned there's this pipeline, there's this honeypot where the federal agency actually goes out to train the people. We want to radicalize you before you commit radicalize you first, and then radicalize you, and what did you say? Strengthen and then weaken the inhibitors, right? We got a process to get you to commit the violence, so we have a justification for our legal definitions. Do I have that right?
Correct. Yes, and that's why the whistleblowers are coming to Congress saying, you know, we're being told by our leaders to overinflate our domestic violent extremism cases. Now, this is why it's important to Washington State's commission, okay? Because the Attorney General specifically was relying on FBI domestic violent extremism data. And so the question that we were asking to the legislature is, you're relying on the Attorney General who is relying on FBI data when you have whistleblowers who are saying that that data is overinflated on purpose. Time out. But it passed committee 1, it passes committee 2. They bypass committee 3 and they go to the floor and it passes the House, which tells you, again, this is not a bipartisan thing. This is a partisan weapon against political opponents.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the one of the experts they used in their commission, Cynthia Idris, is a member of their extremism council for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and SPLC has a history of inciting violence. Whether they did it directly or not, in 2012, you have a young man who goes to their website to look at their list to identify people who are supposedly hate LGBTQ people. And so he accumulates a gun and ammunition and Chick-fil-A sandwiches, goes to the Family Research Council, starts shooting, injures the security guard who subdues him, saves a lot of people's lives. And in his interrogation, he admits that he went to the Southern Poverty Law Center's extremism list, their private list. Okay? So not only do they have a history now tied to somebody using their list based on their private definition to commit acts of violence. So talk about weakening the inhibitor, strengthening the destabilizer, and then leading them along the path to radicalization to where this young man crosses the wall of frustration that he feels he has to kill someone. I'm like, time out. That's not bipartisan at all. That now indicates to me that SPLC is acting as if they are a legislative body who has justification to circumvent our system of legislative checks and balances to train law enforcement officers across the United States, as well as to incite violence from the public. Whoa, now we're getting really deep, because 2019 in Washington State, a member of Antifa named William von Spronson purchased propane tanks and ammunition and guns and drove to a federal facility to kill federal agents and blow the building up in the name of his ideology. So weakened as an inhibitor, strengthened the destabilizer, pathway to radicalization, he crosses the wall of frustration and commits an act of violence. But do you find that anywhere on Southern Poverty Law Center's website for extremism, anti-government, pathways to violence? It's not mentioned anywhere. And so, again, I just want to make the case to your audience. This is not a partisan question. This is a matter of the Puritans weaponizing labels, using government as a weapon to target their political opponents. And that is not progressive at all. That's actually regressive in terms of world history. And that's my only point, because I will fight for SPLC's right to label whoever they want, extreme, anti-government, jerks, whatever name you want to come up with. Go for it. You have every right, SPLC. But when you circumvent the checks and balances of our legislative system, I have to question who actually is anti-government.
So I think we could go ad nauseum in details of where this is springing up all over the country. I'd like to shift the conversation to, what do we do about it? So you mentioned Amazon Smile, and that you guys said, okay, we're gonna gird ourselves to go up against this. And I mean, who knows what actually happened, but it very much looks like you mentioned, that Amazon Smile may have been shut down because the situation was getting too hairy. But that's just Amazon Smile.
I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's just Amazon Smile. What I mean, going back to, for example, Washington State and the ADL and the SPLC getting on these committees to define and guide what domestic terrorism is, and training law enforcement and doing all these other things. What's the solution to get to okay, SPLC, you can say whatever you want. You don't get to be an unauthorized legislature.
So there's a number of things that our organization is doing. So if your audience is willing to go to our website, centerforselfgovernance.com, PWOL. PWOL. That stands for the political weaponization of labels. That page describes what is the political weaponization of labels, what CSG is doing to stop PWOL, what you can do to stop PWOL, what the federal government is doing to stop PWOL, what state governments are doing to stop PWOL, and examples of PWOL beginning in April of 2009. And so that page is a resource for you to understand what I'm talking about in depth, if you would like, to give you ideas for different things that are being done so you can understand the nexus of what the weaponization of labels are and what you can do to stop the political weaponization of labels for yourself. And there's just a laundry list of things you can choose from. One of the things that we are doing is we have created another page on our website, centerforselfgovernance.com/PWOG. This stands for the political weaponization of government. Now, this is really important because Congress right now has a committee called the Weaponization of Government Committee. So we have a suggestion for you and your audience. If you believe, perceive, directly or indirectly, that government has become a weapon against you instead of a tool to protect you or defend you, we would suggest that you go to that page and follow those instructions. It's very specific. You fill out an affidavit, single page, either direct or indirect victimization of the weaponization of government, and then you send it to your congressman, or both. You send it to the Committee on the Weaponization of Government in Washington, D.C. All the information is on that page for you to follow.
That's excellent.
So those are two specific things. One is a deep dive into the weaponization of labels. It's a chronology based on our experience. We've put together from our students across the nation what you can do, what's happening at the federal, what's happening at the state, and then examples of PWOL in the United States beginning in 2009. The PWOG page is specific to those who feel like they've been victimized. Let me give you an example. So Dylan, I was on the phone with a state representative from North Dakota recently. And
who I've had on the show, by the way.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
Yep.
So Representative Cole Christensen, you've had him on the show. He introduced a bill on what I would call checks and balances of the Domestic Terrorism Act. Okay. And it passed the House 86-7, I believe. And he successfully was able to drive that through. And at the end of our conversation, you know what he said to me? He was being serious, Dylan. He wasn't joking around.
Yeah.
He literally said to me, Mark, am I on some list because I got this passed in North Dakota? And you know what I thought to myself? I became emotional at that point because I'm like, I don't know about you guys who are listening to Irida TV or whoever else is going to watch this. Do you want to live in a country where you're constantly wondering if you're on a list?
No, yeah, no kidding. I mean, you brought up the Nazi Germany example, but I think even the Soviet Russia examples more clear on this, where it's like, oh, you're a counter-revolutionary to the Gulag. Oh, you're an anarchist to the Gulag. Oh, you're a fascist to the Gulag. I mean, just anything, any label that you got hit, Gulag, 10 years, bam.
And I'm like, I don't want to live in a country. I want to be a part of a country that is where you don't feel like you're on a list because you're having a conversation. You're exercising your right to question things. Right?
And then, I want to emphasize this, making sure I'm sharing my screen appropriately. No, I'm not. What's going on here?
I see our weaponization of labels.
You see it, but the man, it's not going to work. The recording's not going to see it. Okay, I'm just gonna switch back. I wanted to bring up. I've got the political weaponization of labels that Mark is talking about on his website, and I wanted to emphasize, because you say I asked, what do you do about this? And you said, well, look at our website. We have a lot of things. I just want to emphasize how many things that could be done, but this also shows how this is being infused into every aspect of the government right now. So he's got this chart. This is, again, at centerforselfgovernance.com/PWAL, where we've got executive, legislative, and judicial on the top, and on the left side we've got federal, state, and local, and these are all ideas of how you can work at every single level of government to help to address this situation. Right?
Yes, and there's more than just that for you specifically. There's, like, for example, on the PWOG page, if that's too much for you to do, if like, for example, I had a young lady in Missouri whose grandmother died on the second floor of the hospital because the CDC guidelines prevented them from coming inside to say goodbye. And so they rolled her bed to the window, and the video, you see her hands. She can't raise her because she's dying. She puts her hands on the window, and they're standing outside, and then her hands slide down the window, and that's when she passes away. And I'm like, was that the weaponization of government? Is that a fruit? Is that a consequence of the weaponization of the CDC? You see my point? And I'm like, if any of your listeners have that kind of story, you should not let that story die in vain. Put it on a piece of paper, have a notary stamp it and send it to your congressman, and then send it to the Committee on the Weaponization of Government. Here's an example of what happened to me because of those CDC guidelines. Is that right? And ask the question, was that the weaponization of the government? Is that an example? Okay, Cole Christensen, the representative, he asked me, am I on a list now? So I told him, I said, Cole, would you please fill one of these papers out? You're a state representative. Are we supposed to be asking that question in the North Dakota State Legislature? Am I on a list because I was representing my constituents on a checks and balances domestic terrorism act? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
and then
I
send
get
that
it.
to the
Yeah,
committee.
he's quite I don't know if he's afraid to act, but he does seem to have some concern about the consequences of, like, I'm just acting in the normal way that that the system's supposed to work. Am I going to end up on a list that I got to worry about?
And then you ask the committee, because then guess what? They can ask the question, is he on a list? Where is the list? How many lists are there? These are the right questions that we should be asking at a very basic level. What is the legal label? Where is the legal list? And who is allowed to make the legal lectures? Okay, because Southern Poverty Law Center has created a private label with a private list and private lectures that have circumvented the legislative authority and is now using the executive branch as their weapon. And I think that needs a serious conversation in Congress through the Weaponization of Government Committee, not to go after SPLC, but any non-government, including my organization. We're nonprofit. We should not be creating our private labels with our private list
and training the executive branch
to become a weapon against SPLC. And I would say I don't think SPLC should be doing the same thing either.
I'm going to save this for a future conversation. But I am.
And by the way, I'm going to have to, just so you know, we have to step off because we have a 2-hour drive. To a presentation. I'm going to be giving a presentation to the Freedom Caucus, the one that was in a big, huge fight, and Glenn Beck tweeted. I'm speaking to them tonight here in South Carolina.
I bet that'll be fun.
We shall see.
Have you read Tragedy and Hope by Carl Quigley?
I think I started and never finished.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's 4 million pages long. I don't blame you for that, but you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, what you just said harkens back to what me and Nima have talked about ad nauseum, which is the historical process that Quigley refers to, or that Quigley describes, of how societal instruments, eventually become institutionalized and controlled by vested interests. And I guess I'm just expressing this for the listeners. I have an idea for a future show now that you Now that you've mentioned
Okay.
that.
Well,
Mixing what
I'm
Mark's
wide-
talking
I'm
about
wide
with Carol
open.
Quigley.
By the way, we're headed. So in terms of like what is CSG doing, we're going to DC on Monday and Tuesday, March 6th and 7th. And we're meeting with several senators and several congressmen and women. We're going to be going into their offices to see different legislators' appointments with their legislative directors and chiefs of staff, so that we can continue this conversation. And in the words of the chairman of the Weaponization Committee, Congressman Jim Jordan, we're not going after people. We just want this to stop.
Mm-hmm. Great. Before you leave, if someone is interested in learning and being trained in the techniques that you teach, how do they find out more?
And that's crazy, because that's what I originally got into this for, was what is self-governance? How do I self-govern? What is our system of governance, and how do we work together to make it better? And I haven't really got a chance to talk about that today, because we're having to deal with a private organization acting like a legislative body and weaponizing government against its perceived political opponents. Centerforselfgovernance.com. We teach leadership in self-governance. And I don't mean you do what you want and I'll do what I want. You stay out of my way and I'll stay out of. No. I'm talking about governing myself first before ever governing somebody else. Loving your liberty, or elevating your liberty as much as, if not more than, my own personal influence. And most importantly, never speak or think of government as a person. Never give it the honor of personalizing it. Those three principles of self-governance are part of our leadership and self-governance series, and I encourage anyone, whether you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, whether you're this color or whatever freaking colors there are, if you're human, how about this? If you're human and you want to learn leadership and self-governance, our organization does not discriminate.
That's great. Well, Mark, I appreciate you again taking the time to come on. This is always a fascinating conversation when you come on. I wish you much luck, or of whatever variety that you need at the Freedom Caucus tonight. And as well as much luck when you speak to those senators over in Washington, D.C. I'm very, very curious how this committee on the weaponization of government is gonna move forward.
I am too, and that's why we're going. We want to let them know that if we want to make progress in the 21st century and not regress to these historical examples I gave at the beginning, really important that we get this right over the next 2 years. So we'll be happy to give you an update, and thank you for having me on today.
Awesome. This is Mark Herr, or this has been Mark Herr with the Center for Self-Governance at centerforselfgovernance.com, and Dylan Moore with Irida TV, which you can check out at irida.tv. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.